an atlas, and I was like, wow, Bratislava, Slovakia, that's this new country. It's not that far deep into Central and Eastern Europe. It's essentially a suburb of Vienna. I've been to Vienna before, and I'm like, I'll put that down. There's no way I'm going to go there. And sure enough, that's where I ended up studying on the Olmsted program. So I had to learn Czech and Slovak. And then I got to Bratislava.
Really?
And I studied, it was really interesting. They transitioned. They were a new country transitioning from, communism. I studied in the former Institute of Marxist-Leninism at Communist University that was now the Department of Political Science. And most of the instructors that I had been dissidents or imprisoned, in the old regime.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting and fascinating experience. But man, it was like plebe year again.
Welcome to the Courage Never Quits podcast, where members of the West Point class of 1986 tell their stories. I'm your host, Paul LaFontaine. My guest today is Patrick Antonietti, Cullum number 42895. We'll hear about Pat's deployment to Kosovo, all the way up through his policy roles at increasingly senior levels. As always, the views expressed in this podcast are those of the participants, not of West Point, the Army, or any government organization, most particularly the Office of the Secretary of Defense. Pat Antonietti, welcome to the podcast.
Paul, it's great to see you again, and thanks for having me.
It's great to have you here. So let's go back to the very, very essence of it. Your howitzer entry, was that accurate?
No, let's say about 3/4 accurate. How about that?
So some of it was accurate.
Yes.
Now, is it true that your nickname was Anton?
A lot of people call me Anton because of my last name. Yeah, Antonietti. They shortened it to that. So some people still call me that today.
We're not very creative on our nicknames, right? Unfortunately, you fall in that category as well by just shortening your name, basically.
That's right. Not too.
I read Norman Schwarzkopf's autobiography, and they called him Schwartzy. So I mean, even some of the greats were named pretty basic nicknames.
Well, it's good to know I'm in that kind of esteem. So thanks for pointing that out.
Well, when we talk about peer groups, it's always important to start off that way. Helena, Montana. You're a young man from Montana, 1978 to 82. What was it about West Point that got you interested?
Well, it's a good story. I mean, I was born in Montana. My parents were born in Montana on my mom's side, my grandparents as well. So we're kind of natives. We're not, new to the state. On my dad's side, my grandparents immigrated from the northwest corner of Italy, so coming from the Alps to the Rocky Mountains. And so I grew up between Butte, Billings, and Helena, Montana, in the cities of the state, if you will.
Right.
And, I think our generation, we were all affected by World War II in some regard. My dad served in the Army at the tail end of the war on the island of Japan in the 1st Cavalry Division. His brother, my Uncle Joe, he was in the Navy in a landing craft unit that served on, in D-Day and then in the island hopping campaign of the Pacific. He would always say he was lucky to have survived the war because half his unit was killed. My mom's brother, my Uncle Jack, was in the Navy for 4 years. And my mom always told the story. She was a little girl about driving to San Francisco to meet him on his one furlough in 4 years when he married my aunt. And so then there were other friends of family and neighbors that, all had these World War II kind of stories, but they all came back to Montana for the most part. And so I lived in Helena when we moved there. We grew up on a cul-de-sac, and there was a gentleman across the street named Bill Opitz, and he had gone to the Naval Academy around the same time as Roger Staubach and Joe Bellino and played football. And his brother was my high school basketball coach and history teacher. And they thought I would be interested in maybe a service academy. But we had vacationed as a kid going west. We went to Seattle, California, up into Canada. I'm one of 8 kids. It was kind of like the Brady Bunch. We'd hop in a station wagon and off we'd go. And
right.
A lot of Montana people do have connections to some of the bigger cities out there. And so like my mom lived in Seattle when she got out of college. We visited there, and I got interested in the University of Washington. So that was one of the schools I thought I would attend. I applied and got in. West Point was kind of a late thought for me, and I applied and I was delayed. I didn't get in initially because I had some head injuries as a kid. I fell off the deck and was knocked out for a time when I was young, and then I was in a bike wreck and I had a concussion. And so I failed the physical exam, and I had to go
Really?
for some neurological testing to make sure I didn't have a seizure disorder. And so I got in late, and I had already been accepted to the University of Washington, but UW at the time was on a quarter system. It didn't start till September, and I figured, I'd try West Point, give it a shot, and if it didn't work out, I kind of had a fallback. But I
Right.
had been east of Rapid City, South Dakota, until I got on an airplane and flew to LaGuardia Airport. And then, kind of funny story about that, my dad said, hey, when you get to LaGuardia, you're going to stay with a friend of mine and his wife. They live in the Bronx. It was an African-American couple. And so they met me at the airport, and I stayed in the Bronx for a couple of days, and they took me to a Yankees game and all around New York City. And the Larkins, John and Burnell Larkin, became good friends, came to graduation. They came up to a couple of football games, and it was, kind of people close by. But they drove me to Mike Lee Stadium, and we shook hands, and I said, thanks for taking me. And then my world
Yeah. So what was it like going from Montana to finding yourself in the Bronx just prior to reporting to West Point?
Man, it was like about as far as Kansas or Montana, as they say, as you could be. It was fascinating, though. You grew up watching and learning about New York on TV and that sort of thing. But it was just a totally different world from little Helena, Montana. That's for sure.
So in Montana, when you were in high school or a kid, was it how we all envisioned Montana to be? Were you out riding horses, or was it more of a suburban lifestyle? How did you grow up?
It was more suburban. We grew up in the cities. Butte, Montana was the kind of the industrial city in Montana.
Academics, sports, what was it that was your strong point that got you into the academy?
A little bit of both, but in Montana, if you're a halfway decent athlete, you can play sports all year round because there weren't that many people. But I went to one of the bigger high schools, but I did well in sports and was kind of an all around, average, above average athlete, football, basketball. Yeah. Right. And I was a kind of a gym rat at school. I played a lot of basketball there, and I was, my yearling year, we won the brigade championship in company D4. So that was kind of a fun thing.
Yeah, good for you.
Yeah.
Now, did you do any prep before you went, or you just hit it cold when you were back to RD?
I knew, my oldest brother had a good friend who went to West Point, and he left his plebe year. He's now a retired judge back home, and he said, you're not going to, that's a tough place to go. You better think about what you're doing. So I knew it was going to be hard, and talked to a couple people. There was the guy who interviewed you about going to the service academy. He was like a class of early 60s maybe, but not a lot. And I read a little bit, but it's probably almost better that I didn't know as much as, right. I should have. I just kind of went in cold, and right. It was a tough first year, though. We'll say that.
And then our day in Beast Barracks, how was what was your experience there in terms of which company were you in, and how'd that go?
I was in second company, and fortunately for me, my squad, Jimmy Diorio was in my squad, if you know Jim. And Jim was kind of, he'd gone to the prep school. He was from New Jersey. He helped a lot of us that were kind of clueless about everything on shining a belt buckle on your shoes, and, what a gig line is and a dress off and all these things. And he's very funny. So he was a really good guy to have in our squad.
He's an outgoing fella, we call
what's
it.
That?
He's an outgoing fella.
Yes,
Jim.
He very much is. He's one of the more naturally funny guys I've ever met. I always told him he should be a comedian.
What was the craziest thing that happened to you in Beast? What was the moment where you just looked around and said, boy, I am not in Montana anymore?
Oh, it was probably at the meals. We would get yelled at, 9 of us putting our forks down and hearing everybody get, one guy get yelled at so we couldn't yell or eat, and then going back to our rooms hungry. I remember there was one dessert that I always wished I could have, and whenever it came up it was like some type of brownie, and it looked really good, but we never got to the dessert, during the meals, whenever that was dessert, because he would just
they couldn't deny us food, but the dessert was optional, so they always seemed to scheme that we didn't get the dessert. I remember that.
Yeah, but my seminal experience as a plebe was reorg week. I can still remember at Lake Frederick, I don't know if you remember this, but your platoon cadre called you all together and said what academic year companies you were going to. And so we were all going to 1st Regiment. And 1st Regiment was a great place to be as a plebe. And so I remember the upperclassmen saying, like, maybe it was Todd Etheridge was going to company H1. They're like, Etheridge, what the motto is of H1? It's the hotel. You check him in, we check him out. You're going to get checked out. And it was like, wow, what are they talking about? And then somebody said, he's going to A1. They're like, what the motto is of A1? Be straight or be gone. You better watch it. You're going to be gone. And I'm like, what is going on? And then it was D1. So Jimmy Diori and I went to company D1. And D1 didn't have a really good motto. It was like, go Ducks. So they couldn't say anything like that. But they just kind of went, ooh. And I was like, wow, what does that mean? And so then, we get to our academic year company. I'm the head mail carrier.
Right.
And man, talk about like
that was your initial experience, the head mail carrier.
Yeah. So, where you had to literally deliver mail all to every upperclassman in the company. We were in Old South, so in these divisions, you didn't know where anybody lived or who they were, and what got me in trouble was the regimental executive officer of First Regiment was a guy named Dan Keefe. And I know his name because his mail piled up on my desk all week. Because whenever we sent a mail carrier over to A1 in Pershing Barracks, they never came back. They were gone for like an hour. And then the mail, they would come back and they're, Pat O'Connor, Bill Doherty, Bill Bassinet. I still see these guys and they're like, man, I can't believe you made it through reorg week. And so the Friday before, our first big SAMI inspection, the door opened. Ken Curtis was my roommate. We were getting ready. We were already like figuring out how to get over on West Point. So I don't know if you remember, but we had to lay out our TA-50 from Lake Frederick for inspection. So we were like going to sleep on the floor and not have to deal with that nonsense in the morning. And right before we were going to bed, the door bangs. In comes Cadet Keefe. And he's like, where's my mail? It's like, sir, it's right on my desk. And he's like, I can't believe you couldn't get me my mail. And I'm like, no excuse, sir. So I had a company board. And
oh, wow.
So I had to, report. I got a bunch of demerits. And I think I might have gotten like suspended area tours because my squad leader was a guy named Garen Greer, who I think had some sympathy for me because we tried to get mail to everybody, but we just failed.
Yeah, right.
Getting yelled at.
Board, though, for head mail carrier, that's tough.
It was, yeah. And then, I was thinking about this. The next week, we started academics. And I don't know about you, but I failed miserably my first plebe English paper. Like I remember getting the paper back and there was just like red on every page. It was like the professor was bleeding almost. And I'm like, wow, am I really that bad of a writer? And so I feared going to summer school, and so already they said, if you fail, you're going to go to summer school. You'll never go home. And I was like, wow, that's crazy. So for all of our classmates that went to summer school, like my hats is off to them because I'm not sure I could have done that, particularly plebe year. So anyway, we had an in-class essay, like the next time we're getting graded. And I can still remember, like, you got a little piece of paper and it was like, write a story about somebody that had some hardship and they made it through. And if you remember, it was like we were reading the sports pages and the front page of the New York Times all the time. And so it was football season. And so I kind of wrote this article about what I thought was not a very good paper about a football player making it through spring, summer camp and to an NFL team. So when I handed the papers out, the professor comes in, he hands them to everybody, and I don't get mine. I'm like, oh man, he's going to talk to me about it failing again. And he goes, now let me read you a really good essay that got an A. And I'm thinking, wow, that's my paper. I just went from getting an F to an A. Like, how did that happen? I haven't changed in a week. But the professor was a guy named Major Lynn Moore. Lynn Moore was a captain of the Army football team. He was a running back. He gained 1,000 yards as a firstie. He was the MVP of the Army Navy game when they won 27-0. This is back in like 1969. And I don't know if he felt sorry for me or what, but I quickly went back to getting like C+ and B-. But that
you peaked with the football story.
That's right. But I thought, after getting the company board, failing plebe English, I thought I was doomed and never going to get out of there, plebe year. And then, as you just have these little steps along the way that keep you, that are little, milestones that keep happening. And you're like, if I can only get, to the next football game and then Army Navy and Christmas, and you just keep going. So anyway.
If you can just get to where you can get your stereo, bring your stereo back, everything's going to be okay.
Yeah, that's right. With your cassette tapes.
With your cassette tapes. So D1 ended up being a hard company, or what?
Oh yeah, it was. I mean, I think Pat Gavin was on, and he mentioned it. And it was like every class yelled at you. You know, it was just a tough
Right.
company all the way around. The yearlings and cows in particular.
Everybody was on board.
But what that did was very much bring our plebe, group together. We had a lot of really good people in that company. You know, Kirk Gutierrez, Donnie Smith, Billy Noble, Pat O'Connor. I mentioned Jimmy D.
Yeah.
Rich Pasco was in there. I mean, there was a lot of good guys that when we see each other, it's kind of like, that was something that we made it through the gauntlet of 1st Regiment.
So you switched now to 4th Regiment as an upperclassman, right?
Yeah. So from D1 to D4. So, you know, we lived in that short wing of MacArthur Barracks that overlooked the Soup's backyard right by MacArthur statue. And so in that part of MacArthur Barracks at the top was B4 and C4. Jimmy Dora, as an example, went from D1 to C4. A lot of good friends. That's a very tight company. They have a lot of good guys that are together today. And then D4, E4. And then as we went over to the mess hall, particularly in the winter, we would go through these doors and we'd be in the 3rd Regiment area of Washington Hall. So that's where H3 and I3 and G3 were. And so got to, you just saw those people more as upperclassmen. And people in 1st Regiment you never really saw living in 4th Regiment unless you were in the same class or something. But day to day.
Well, that's how we knew each other, because I was in I3, so we were kind of in the same area, and we were always cutting through to get out of the cold weather.
That's right. Exactly. The wind of the Sally Port.
Right. That was the primary way we got to know each other, was cutting through to class, and then we'd hail each other as we went by. So
yeah, and I think we might have been in a class.
What did your so D4? What was your course of study? Were you academics? I saw you were in the French club. What kept you busy?
Yeah, so I picked HPA at the end of our yearling year, and I studied. I had a concentration in international relations, so I took like the 8 electives we could in the social department and history. I liked school for the most part, and did well in the MSc side of it for the most, in the top 3rd class kind of thing. But I had a couple seminal experiences that I think, as I look back, one was in the French club. I went on a French-speaking cultural exchange. It was with Dave DeRoche and Trey Tumano and Kat Stewart. And it was not really because of French, but because we got 3 extra days of spring break. And so we flew, it was this amazing trip. We flew to Paris and then to Casablanca.
Didn't you guys go to Morocco?
We went to Morocco, and we were hosted, by the embassy. So I remember meeting the defense attaché. We flew to Casablanca, went to Rabat, where the capital. And then we lived with the Moroccan Military Academy, and it was kind of like a Sandhurst model, where they were studying, but also, we had to bring our BDUs. We did a land nav course in the desert one night, they taught us how they land nav off of using the stars and the wind in the desert, which was kind of crazy. Yeah. And then the Moroccan army was fighting the Polisario guerrillas from Algeria at the time. There's a UN peacekeeping mission to this day over the independence or not of Western Sahara. And that had just started. And we talked with this platoon that had just come back from the fighting there. It was like a kind of a seminal experience. And then I had a pretty good experience on CTLT. I went that summer to 1st Armor Division, went to Airborne School, and then to 1st Armor Division. I was an air defense platoon leader. I was in 259 Air Defense Artillery right there in 1st Armor Division. When I got to the unit, they're like, hey, we're short lieutenants. You're the platoon leader in Bravo Battery. In those days, the Air Defense Battalion had a Chaparral Battery, a Vulcan Battery, and a Manpads or a Stinger Battery. And I was the Vulcan platoon leader. The truth of the matter, though, is the best NCO, the platoon sergeant, was my platoon sergeant. But it was the beginning of it was a really good battalion. So they, they took me in. We live fired, we rail loaded, went way to the north of Germany. I don't know if you know how a Vulcan live fires, but we were on these cliffs overlooking the Baltic Sea, and a plane would fly in front of you, a biplane dragging a 300 meters behind was a radar sleeve. And so we would go in front of you, and then you had these left and right limits over this cliff, and the Vulcan radar would key on leave and shoot. It was crazy. And I had
That
another.
was been exciting though. Is what a 20-year-old
Yeah,
doing that? 21, right?
yeah. And then another kind of funny story. We had a CPX with like one of the maneuver brigades. So we had Jeeps then, not even Humvees, leaving Schwabach in this convoy, going over to the Czech border, and the Jeep I'm in breaks down on the side of the Autobahn outside of Nuremberg, and we kind of break contact with the convoy, and the driver was super squared away. And he's like, "Oh, sir, this stupid Jeep, it happens all the time," and he was under the hood and fixing everything, and we got it going, and
Wow.
we had a grid to where the talk was in the field, and I was always a pretty good map reader, so we get in radio distance of the battery talk, and they tell me like, "Hey, go right to your maneuver talk. Here's the grid, and report when you get there." So I'm like, "Okay." So I write the grid down, and we find the maneuver talk, and I learned the lesson on how to enter a talk from this experience, because if you remember, like the talks, like we're in the open German countryside, a maneuver rights area, in this hollow, in a meadow, and with camouflage, and they're always big on noise and light discipline, and I couldn't figure out how to get in. And so then, if you remember, when you went into a talk, there were curtains, to hide all the noise and the light, and so I kind of come stumbling in. I think I kind of turned over a table. I had my cadet rank. The weapon of issue in an air defense battalion was a grease gun. It's a 45 millimeter, like World War II gun. And so all these people were around this map board, and I come stumbling in, and I think it was the S3. He turns up and he goes, "Who the hell are you?" And I'm like, "Sir, it's Cadet Antonietti. I'm your Vulcan platoon leader." And the whole talk just starts laughing. "You're our Vulcan platoon leader?"
Over tables.
Yeah, and then they're like,
flying.
"Duck Hunter, great job. We're glad you're on the team." But they really took me into the fold though, after the marvelous introduction. So I learned that lesson about whenever I went into a talk after that, I'm like, "Okay, just don't, trip over the table coming in or figure out where the."
It was a non-trivial thing getting it out of a talk. I was an S2 up front, so we learned the skill pretty early, but you could always tell the field guys because they'd be slapping the side of the thing trying to get in and find the entrance way, right?
Exactly.
Went to Morocco. You were able to have a great CTLT, and then you ended up going field artillery. So how did that all tie together for you?
Yeah, so I knew I wanted to go combat arms. I think somebody else mentioned about our time at Fort Knox, riding around in a tank and in a mechanized infantry 113. So I didn't want to do those. But the thing about artillery is that if you're a fire support officer, you can, work with the infantry and the artillery or the armor. Sorry. And so that kind of appealed to me. A lot of my friends went field artillery. I had some professors that also, I remember kind of were good examples. And but again, I thought I was going to get out at the 5-year mark. But I think most of our class, combat arms, the big 5 or 6 branches were what we were going to do for the most part, unless you were going to medical school or had some other interest like signal or military intelligence.
You had a very special program if you were to do something other than those basic combat arms branches. So, well, before you graduated, what was your what did you do? I saw the French club and other things. What kept you busy as an upperclassman? What was your entertainments?
I was an intramural sport guy, so I played all kinds of from football to basketball and coached. Was in the finance forum as well a little bit, but for the most part, I was just going to school and trying to keep my head above water. And I had a lot of good friends that were from the area. So Steve Cannon, Jimmy Dioro, we talked about, Pat Daly, Shane Downey, and I was in my company from Connecticut. Pat O'Connor was from Long Island. John McHugh was one of my roommates. John and Jim were best friends in Caldwell, Roseland, New Jersey. So I always had somebody to go with on a weekend. Stan Wilson was a roommate. His parents were down in the D.C. area. So we went to a lot of sporting events, and when we got more privileges, I think I mentioned Judd Bass was my roommate first semester we were on brigade staff together, and Judd was a really good Renaissance man, as we talked about, just a little step ahead of those of us like
He
me.
was my first year roommate, second semester. So he was yours first and mine second semester.
Yeah. Yeah. So, so really focused on just keeping my nose clean and graduating and, moving on to the big Army, I guess. But never really
Yeah,
thought much about the Army when we were cadets, as, that's the purpose of the military academy, is really that you, uh, serve in the Army, and, maybe some of us stay as long as I did, but I didn't think I was going to do that.
absolutely. Your first duty assignment, what was the logic there? You had a great CTLT. What was the thinking?
Yeah, so going back to Germany, of course, and that's kind of an interesting story. Do you remember, we picked our branch, and then we picked a assignment night. So, for the field artillery, there were like 200 plus of us in one of the auditoriums, and you sat, class rank. You knew from 1 to 220, and the guys in the middle. It was funny because everyone brought all these maps of Germany to see where they might end up, because
Right.
there was a lot of artillery in Germany. But I had a professor who was like, hey, if you want to go to Germany, I wanted to go as far south in Germany as I could, to be kind of near Austria and skiing and that kind of thing. But if you picked a division, you could end up in one of 3 DS artillery battalions. You could be in an MRS battery. You could get stuck at the Divarti. But there were a couple of separate brigades in Germany at the time. So one of them was 1st Infantry Division Forward, and that was way in the south of Germany in 7th Corps. And the DS Artillery Battalion was in Neu-Ulm, Germany, right on the Danube River between Munich and Stuttgart. And if you picked first ID, you knew that's where you were going. And there were 2 slots, and I got one of them. And
Okay.
First Division, wow, that was a really great assignment. We were a big brigade in a German division, part of a U.S. Corps. And when I got there, as a company fire support officer right away. Mike Lemansky, our classmate, Alpha Company 116 Infantry, he was a platoon leader in that company. And my boss said, hey, we're getting ready to go to the field. So I was thinking, I'd gone to Ranger school, so I'm like, getting all my TA-50 together. And he's like, no, it's called a tactical exercise without troops. It's a toot. And I'm like, well, what does that mean? He goes, we're going on the buses and we're going to Normandy. So the 16th Infantry Regiment landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day. So the infantry battalion went for a week. We went for a week we stayed in the city of Caen, and we retraced the exploits of the battalion all week. Like each day, a different company had a lesson to teach. And what was really interesting was the honorary colonel of the 16th Infantry Regiment was a retired Major General named Albert Smith, who on D-Day was the battalion XO of that unit. And
No kidding.
Every lesson he would kind of say, well, this is what we were really doing and thinking. And, we had a lunch, a couple of lunches with towns that the unit liberated, and they did just put on these big spreads and ladies bringing still tears, and then one of the lieutenants in that battalion won the Medal of Honor, a guy named Jimmy Monteith. We had a big ceremony at the cemetery there in Normandy. So that was like my first sort of experience in the Army. And then the next year was one of the big reforger exercises. I was a platoon leader with corps on corps, and just
What kind of platoon did you have?
I was it was a M109 howitzer, four guns, 4 fast Vs, a fire direction center. And then my last year, I was an aide-de-camp to the commander of that organization. And that was when the wall came down, which was crazy because nobody expected. In the fall of 1988, myself and Steve Cannon and Larry Oliver, we drove to Berlin, like all the way around Germany, from Checkpoint Alpha to Checkpoint Bravo into West Berlin. And we ran the Berlin Marathon. And the marathon started right at the Brandenburg Gate. And there are all these Russian guards, looking down at us, and everybody's like not saying nice things to them as the start of the race was about to begin. And 10 months later, that was all gone. It was just totally unpredictable and kind of interesting and cool to see all that happen while we were there.
A view into history, right? You knew it was history when you were there.
Yeah, it really was. And so I figured I had 2 years left, I'd served my 3 years in Germany, maybe like even more because of, OBC. I went to the junior motor officer course, Ranger School. So I didn't get to my first unit till the spring of '87. And I
Right.
wanted to be back on somewhere in the West. So I was assigned to Fort Ord as my second assignment in the 7th Infantry Division.
Really?
And if there was I think we benefited, if you stayed in or not. I mean, if you step back and look what the Army was doing when we were there, it was kind of an interesting time for us to serve. In the 70s, after, Vietnam and the impact of the draft ending, all volunteer force, the Army kind of retooled strategically. They invented the Training and Doctrine Command. Creighton Abrams sort of took the lessons from Vietnam and the Yom Kippur War in 1973 with all this Soviet equipment that was used on the battlefield there. And that began a modernization effort. Training and command was stood up, the combat training centers, air-land battle, all the things you executed in the Desert Storm.
Yeah.
And then we had the revolution in training, this battle-focused training that when I was a company or battery commander, focused on your mission essential tasks and what are the battle tasks and how do you resource those. I mean, it was a really, momentous time or pivotal time to be in the Army, and all that manifested in what happened in Just Cause and Desert Storm, and then even later. But Fort Ord, man, the light divisions, I think you might have been there at CTLT and got a little bit of a different experience because they were transforming. But that was a great unit where people were very focused on, infiltration was the form of maneuver, and we road marched and, did PT all the time and live fire training. And there was the only division there on Fort Ord. It was the only unit. So there was a lot of esprit and camaraderie. Yeah. Every payday there was a CG golf tournament. If you're in the field or not, you're expected to have a golf team on the beautiful golf courses. And then we lived in Monterey, and the Bay Area was not too far. And it was just a phenomenal place to serve. And all my assignments are always a number of classmates around too. That particular assignment, Lee Rudisell and I were roommates for a little while. Then he went to the Ranger Battalion up at Fort Lewis, and John Ponce, Wade Yost, Brian Bulleto, John Mulberry were all there. But then, that was at the time of the downsizing after the wall came down. So we were slated to move to Fort Lewis, the whole division. And then just by kind of luck and chance, as we started moving, I was in 1st Brigade, the DS Artillery Battalion supporting 1st Brigade. So we were in the middle of the move. We were first and we were going. And then they decided to inactivate the rest of the division. So guys like Brian Bulleto and John Mulberry, they were company commanders in other units. And now all of a sudden they weren't going to get branch qualified in their 12 months. I remember Brian one night, he came back from an exercise. He goes, yeah, I applied to business school last night. And, if I get in, that's what I'm probably going to do. And that's what happened to him. So a lot of people left because of the downsizing. Yeah. But we moved up to Fort Lewis, and I took battery command. I took command 1 week, and the next week a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Ray Odierno was my battalion commander, who later became the Chief of Staff of the Army. So he was a great mentor, leader, and we had a really good group of people in that unit at Fort Ord and Fort Lewis. So again, very lucky in terms of what unit I was assigned to, who the commanders were.
So did the core group in the 7th ever actually go to combat or actually use all those skills?
They did in Just Cause. Oh, yeah.
Just Cause.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely. I got there right after that. And
the work that was put in, you really want to pull for them because they spent years cultivating a very special kind of unit. And so Just Cause, where they were able to do that.
Yeah. And so when I got to Fort Ord, it's interesting because when I was at Fort Sill in the summer of 1990, and we're having this debate with a Marine about why do you guys still need heavy divisions? That's crazy. Right. And I'm like, well, a big army just mobilized on the Kuwait border, if you read the news, and then sure enough, Saddam invaded. So what they did, all the people in my advanced course, if you had orders to the 2nd Infantry Division or 7th ID like I did, you proceeded on those orders. But there were guys going to the 24th and the 101st, and they put all their stuff in storage, and they drew TA-50, and they joined the unit in stride. The class behind mine, all those lieutenants or captains, they all said, you're all going to the desert. They graduated in December of 90. And they were all going to be replacements because, they thought there were going to be a number of casualties. I remember driving off of Fort Sill one afternoon, like in August, September, because the the first hospital to deploy to Saudi Arabia was the hospital from Fort Sill. The whole hospital just got up, packed.
Right.
There was a belonged to Third Corps at the time, and I was driving off the Fort Sill, and I'm like, wow, that's a really long train. I've never seen a train on a post like that. And like, what are those silver boxes on the back of all those cars? Well, they were metal caskets, being shipped to Beaumont, Texas, to go over to the to the
when
desert.
we went over there, they told us that we expected in the officer ranks at least 30% casualties.
Yeah, it was.
They just said 1 in 3. Just expect it.
Yeah, no joke. So that was a pretty serious time. But the 7th Division was declared a strategic reserve, a light division. We really didn't have a role in that kind of environment. And we sent a lot of individual augmentees over and the low density MOSs and that kind of. But we watched it all from Fort Ord. So it was kind of odd to.
You stayed there. Your career. You stayed in for 20 years.
21. Yeah.
21. Okay.
Yeah. So after Fort Ord and Lewis, General Odierno was like, hey, you should think about going to graduate school. And so why don't you apply to this program? So there's a great program named after a West Point general named George Olmsted, who served in World War II and in the Orient, the Pacific Theater. And he endowed all this money for scholarships. But the kicker is you have to study in a foreign language, and a committee decides where you study. So you had to take DLAT, the aptitude test for language, and apply, get picked. The committee back here in Washington, there was an executive secretary, a woman named Barbara Schimpf at the time. And so you submitted a list of 10 schools. So I was thinking I'd go back somewhere to Europe, maybe to explore where my grandparents came from. Turin, Italy was one place I had down, Grenoble, France, all these schools around that area. And so I submit the list, and she's like, Pat, you'll probably go to France and you speak, a little bit of French already. We'll get you tuned up with a 6-month course. But the wall came down. If people are going to Europe, the committee is really interested in maybe sending some people into Central and Eastern Europe. So just put 1 or 2 schools down on a new list and send it in. So I'm like, okay, I did what I was told. And I put Budapest, number 9. And I was looking one night at an atlas, and I was like, wow, Bratislava, Slovakia, that's this new country. It's not that far deep into Central and Eastern Europe. It's essentially a suburb of Vienna. I've been to Vienna before, and I'm like, I'll put that down. There's no way I'm going to go there. And sure enough, that's where I ended up studying on the Olmsted program. So I had to learn Czech and Slovak. And then I got to Bratislava.
Really?
And I studied, it was really interesting. They transitioned. They were a new country transitioning from, communism. I studied in the former Institute of Marxist-Leninism at Communist University that was now the Department of Political Science. And most of the instructors that I had been dissidents or imprisoned, in the old regime.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting and fascinating experience. But man, it was like plebe year again in some regard, because it was all in Slovak, and my Slovak was good, but it wasn't that good. I got better over time, and I was I was a captain in the Army, so I was pretty wealthy compared to my student friends who were all coming out of communism. There wasn't a lot of wealth in the country at all, and I would bribe people to go take them to bars and buy them cheap beer to help me translate my papers and get through school. But it was a very interesting time. Tom Donovan was in that program. He was in St. Petersburg. I went and visited Tom in Russia. I flew from Prague to St. Petersburg. I took a train to Moscow all by myself, tooling around Russia. We had another Navy guy that was in Kiev. He would get out of Kiev by flying to Bratislava, he and his wife. But there were a group of throughout that part of Europe, and we all got together on occasion. It turned out to be a good experience, but it wasn't
what a time.
Yeah.
And then what did that lead to in terms of your career? Yeah.
So then I went back to Command and General Staff College with another group of great, all our classmates, all the generals in our classmate were in that class with me. So, Eric Wesley and Leo Quintos and JT Thompson, Bill Turner, Scott Spellman, Greg Fenton, Steve Sliwa. There were a lot of good guys and kind of got re-greened, if you will, about going to the Army. And then, for the Olmsted program is really for people to go back to the operational force, but to have this kind of general broadening experience, particularly in a foreign place, because that's, where most of the time we will be operating. So I went back to Germany to 1st Infantry Division again. There was a lot of reflagging and removing of units, but kind of back near the Vilseck, Bamberg, Germany. But interestingly, we were in the brigade, the lead brigade that went into Kosovo. So that was a very interesting experience. And I spoke Slovak to Serbs in Kosovo, while we were deployed there. We could just.
What was your role in that operation?
I was initially a brigade fire support officer when all the planning happened, and then became a battalion executive officer. So, a whole battalion, artillery battalion deployed as part of 3rd Brigade, 1st Infantry Division. And so,
but you could speak a language that was useful.
Yeah, it was. It was an interesting mission. We were really there to kind of create a safe and secure environment as the Kosovar Albanians. 1 million of them left, and they all came back. And we really were there to protect the remaining Serb enclaves of, villagers that were, farmers and had been in these communities for a long time.
Right.
And there was a lot of, we had to make sure that they were safe. There was some retribution and other bad stuff happening. And there was no legal system. So our lawyers, we had a jail on Camp Bonsteel at the time where if somebody, we had units operating everywhere, and we were like the rule of law and the order of the society at the time until the Kosovan Albanians could start to get that system going. It was a really, challenging, in my work now, what do you do when the shooting stopped, and how do you get communities back to governing themselves and operating without the need of somebody providing the safety and security needed for the citizenry to flourish. And so that was one of those experiences. It was kind of that 90s, operations other than war exercises. We had platoons and batteries kind of all around the sector. We did shoot some artillery. We shot a lot of illumination missions, actually, that we found out in all the targeting cycle. That was the other thing about, being an artilleryman. The artillery officers run the targeting for the maneuver unit that they're assigned to. So a lot of the non-lethal targeting that we were doing, there were a lot of criminal gangs and activity that were happening. Right. We would shoot illumination rounds. There were cell phones that would light up on smuggling routes that we were able to detect. And then that oriented, say, infantry units or armor units to kind of look at those kind of trap lines where people were smuggling everything from, contraband and people and cigarettes, you name it. So, but for the most part, we were trying to get the society back together. But there was still, even today, there's still a lot of tension between the Serbs and the Kosovan Albanians.
Yeah. And then what year was that in your career? You were...
I was a major.
15-year mark?
Yeah, that was 99, 2000. I stayed another year in Germany, and then I came back to the Pentagon. I was on the Joint Staff. So I reported to the Joint Staff in June of 2001.
Okay.
A guy named John Abizade was the division commander of 1st ID. He then became the J5 on the Joint Staff. That's the Strategic Plans and Policy arm of the staff. And so he brought a bunch of us with Balkans experience back to the staff to run. That was like the big show in town at the time.
Right.
And, was there on 9/11. And so 9/11 happened, and I got reoriented. I worked on the crisis action team of Operation Enduring Freedom when that all got started. And then I got hayed one day after working on the crisis action team. Was for about 3 months. The Bonn Accord was signed. The fighting was over, the initial fighting, went back to the Balkans, and then one day was told to go report to a guy named George Casey, had replaced John Abizade, and he said, we need a combat arms guy on the Afghan desk. There was nobody really working on Afghanistan because we had no relations with them before 9/11. And then went to work on that for 2 years, building the Afghan National Army.
You must have a skill in the policy arena, because when you look at your resume, you have so many roles and you've successive seniority. That's a phrase that's correct, but have worked your way up in the policy world. Do you enjoy it? What is it that
Yeah.
makes
So
you effective there?
it's a good question. So I tell people, I'm a practitioner. I'm not a theorist or a PhD kind of person, but I have a lot of practical experience executing national security policy. And if you have an international relations degree, that's kind of one of the few places where I work today on the policy staff of the Secretary of Defense, where you can really do that day in and day out. So I tell people it's kind of like use a sports analogy, like we're on the field, we're on the field of international relations and national security for the country. And sometimes we make a good call and sometimes may score a touchdown. And sometimes we might miss a tackle and let the runner go by. But, the academics and the think tank people that are prevalent here in Washington, it's like, you guys are on the sidelines and in the stands. And, the speed of policy making is way faster than what you're used to in those areas.
Right. And you're reading documents probably well after the activity's already moved on, right?
And then when I was in Slovakia, I had to write a thesis, and I did it on the civil-military relations in terms of how a civilian political class, controls the military, because the communist countries, they hadn't done that in the past. So it was really interesting to be studying that then. And I had incredible access because I spoke the language and could get around and talk to people, and they were interested. And nobody else was interested in this topic at the time. But I saw then this in practice, when I was on the Joint Staff. I had orders to 3rd Infantry Division. That's where I was a battalion commander at Fort Stewart. And so when I was working on Afghanistan, in the same vein, all the planning for Iraq was ongoing. And I remember running into a good friend from my days in Germany, summer of 2002, and we were arguing for more forces at the time in Afghanistan. And I ran into him in the hallway. He was a SAMS planner and a really good guy in the planning staff of the Joint Staff. I was like, John, you're here. What's going on? He goes, I'm here for the next phase. And I'm like, oh, great. We're getting more forces for Afghanistan. And he was like, no. And I was like, Iraq? And he was like, wow. What, how is that being decided? So because of that experience, when I did get out of the Army, I kind of got recruited to come back in on the civilian side of that.
Yeah. Now, how did that? You were a country officer right off the bat, or how did that work? What was the?
Yeah, so I got out. I retired at Fort Stewart after serving in Iraq, and moved back here. And I was in the private sector. And one of my old brigade commanders was one of Donald Rumsfeld's aides, a guy named Will Grimsley, really good. He commanded 1st Brigade of 3rd ID on the attack to Baghdad. Rock Marcone was one of his battalion commanders. Rock and I commanded for about a year together at Stewart.
We don't want to skip over Iraq. What was your role in Iraq?
I was a battalion commander.
Battalion commander in Iraq. Okay.
Yeah. In OIF 3, though, so that was from 05 to 06. So I took command in the summer of 03 when they were all coming back. Mm-hmm. And then we thought that we weren't going to go back to Iraq. So we did all these train-ups and did all the NTC rotations and that kind of thing. And then in early 04, it was like, hey, we were the only heavy division in CONUS at the time. And they said, you're going back to Iraq. And you'll deploy in about 8 or 9 months. So me, Dave Funk, Steve Merkel, Scott Spellman, Rob Rogeman, John Sutton. Although his battalion didn't deploy, there were a number of us. Jody Petrie were all battalion commanders together, and served. Some of us were 3-year commanders like myself, and we had a pretty. Those are tough days in Iraq, 05, 06.
Yeah, those were tough days.
The crit, Saladin. We had a couple markers, though, while we were there that helped the deployment for our soldiers. We helped the Iraqis through their first election, then a constitutional referendum, then their second election. But we were in the Sunni, working with all the Sunnis in Saladin and Saddam's hometown, and they all boycotted they went to vote, but they voted no against the referendum because they didn't want to partner with the Shia. So it was a really fascinating time to be there, but we lost our brigade. I think had 88 guys killed. The division had about 300. So there was some heady times. And again, this transition after conflict, like how do you bring a society back together with elections, a constitution, all those kinds of things.
So at retirement, you're asked to go back in to do policy work.
Yes.
Were there other options you thought of? Did you have a dark night of the soul, like, hey, I want to try something different, or what was your thinking?
Yeah, good question. I wasn't quite ready, to retire, but I was newly married and I had two young kids at the time. One of them was born while I was in Iraq, and the other one was 2 years old. And my ex-wife now at the time, it was a tough. We married right before battalion command, so that was a tough assignment. So she's from here. We came back, but no, I had some interesting offers, in the private sector. U.S. Steel had recruited me, and I interviewed with them, and they gave me a really interesting offer. But that would have been moving to Pittsburgh, and my ex-wife's from here, so she wanted to come back to this area. I had another really interesting offer from. It's funny. I was walking across the parking lot at Fort Stewart one day. My phone rings, and it's this gentleman named Jamie Krug, and he was the founder and CEO of Falcon Water-Free Technologies. The waterless urinals that you see. And he's laughing. He's like, Pat, we got your resume. I'm not sure how we got it, but we're really interested in your skills, and you'll laugh at our product. I know, given everything you've done, but we'd really like to talk to you about coming and helping our company, and particularly grow its government work. And they flew me out to Los Angeles, where the company, where they all lived, in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And, so if you see those around a restaurant or a stadium, that was, they later sold to Zurn Plumbing Supplies.
Right.
Offer.
A couple opportunities. It wasn't like you were immediately slotted into, because some of our classmates say I was wearing the uniform and I came back the next day in a suit.
No, and I went and worked.
You had a couple things to look at.
And I worked for a small startup company run by a couple of class of 98 guys, a guy named Nate Self. He was the Ranger platoon leader during the Battle of Anaconda. And he and a couple of his classmates got out and started a company in the defense space. And he had come down to Fort Stewart, and I didn't know who he was, and met him and gave him my card. And then he's like, hey, talk to us when you move up. And I went to work for them initially, and then got called to go work back on the Middle East, in the Middle East policy office. And it was kind of weird. When I was retiring, it was when the surge happened. And so if you remember this, you probably, not that you would know this, but 3rd Division was slated to deploy. The 1st Brigade that I was in was already getting ready to go back to Ramadi. They had about a 10-month reset and were 4 months from deploying. And the division was going to deploy in the summer. And then when the surge happened, I was literally in Washington on a job interview. Stop loss authority had been delegated to the division commander. The chief of staff of the division called me. He had been my brigade commander in Iraq, a great guy named Martin McKnight. And he's like, hey, Pat, what's your timeline? I'm like, sir, I enter the retirement roles in 2 weeks. And he goes, we might have to stop loss you. And I'm like, sure, whatever. Just let me know. I'm glad to do whatever. And then there was another artillery officer that hadn't deployed yet, so he kind of came up on the net, and I had a retirement ceremony. The whole division staff was at Fort Stewart getting ready to go. They came in. It was me and one other soldier. It was kind of an odd time to retire. And so 6 months later, the office running all that policy asked, they needed help, and they needed people that knew the region. And so that's how that's why my old brigade commander reached out and said, you should look into this.
So you got back into that line of work. And so you've really stayed with the Secretary of Defense, or in that close to that world since then, right?
Yeah, now 17 years. So
17 years.
What is nice about it?
21 years in the Army and 17 years working in policy.
Yeah. So in the Pentagon, for that long. I mean, the work is interesting. Part of this was my girls were young, was divorced, kind of split custody with them.
Now, how old are they now? We better talk about the girls, or we're going to get in trouble.
Yeah. So Annie and Clara. Annie just turned 19, and Clara's about to turn 21 here in a couple weeks. So
there you
go. You're doing well. Although Clara's had some health issues, but taking a break from school and working, and Annie's in college up in Rhode Island. So they're doing
all right.
But where I do work, this is all my my bosses are the political class. So if you go back to that civil military interest, when like we're getting ready right now, regardless of who wins the election, we're writing transition papers and waiting for the new landing teams are called, after the election's done, to see who will then fill the ranks, the political class, the appointed positions on the Secretary of Defense staff. So getting ready for that. The other thing about where I work is you can move around. I did Middle East work. I took a break and went over to the National War College for a year and studied.
I saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, came back and did some work in with the UN peacekeeping. Like I've been to some pretty hairy places in Africa, like South Sudan, Central African Republic, and Mali, where the UN, and we had some officers serving in those missions.
What's the most rewarding thing about this type of work, regardless of domain, be it the UN or the?
It's when you work across the government, so the interagency we call it. So you're working with a team of professional, competent people, State Department, National Security Council, Treasury, U.S. Agency for International Development, our foreign partners often. And, right now I'm working in Central and Eastern Europe. So today, like we had a big bilateral discussion with the Minister of Defense from North Macedonia, one of the new countries that broke apart during Yugoslavia.
Right.
And the one thing that's enjoyable, that's rewarding, is that I asked them about what do you think of the KFOR mission that I served in Kosovo, and they're like, the Americans must stay. But for America, we would not be an independent in NATO country trying to get into the EU. If you leave, the whole place will fall apart again. So one of them, despite all our faults, people still look to the United States to kind of be the guarantor of stability and security.
Yeah.
As we're seeing with, but for our leadership, what's happening in Ukraine wouldn't be happening.
Right.
So that's, part of it. And then I was alluding to just a lot of really good people that you work with. Sometimes, it's like anywhere, there's good and bad, but for the most part, public servants that are trying to do the right thing. And then every now and then, you can be part of a policy that is getting implemented, and it might have been, something that you were helping push across the goal line and might have even thought of it. So, in that regard, that's something that can be rewarding.
Good for you. Yeah. It's hard to predict, but how long do you keep doing it? Do you knock off soon, or do you just keep doing it until they?
Probably a couple more years. My daughter Annie's a sophomore in college, and we'll get her through school. And then, I've thought a lot about going back to Montana. All my brothers and sisters are still out. I'm going out next week, for an annual fall trip. And
all the rest of us are trying to move there, brother.
Well, yeah, that's right. I hope I can find a house or somewhere to live, or move in with one of my siblings.
My dad has the one place my wife refuses to go because she knows if she sees it, we'll never leave. So she says that we better not go there.
We'll just take her there like February 1st.
Yeah.
Freezing, and she might say, okay, maybe not.
So if you look back, pick any time in your past that you can go back and give yourself advice. So you can go through the Wayback Machine and give yourself advice at any time. Where would you go and what would you say?
I would probably, I could go to many places, but probably in my younger days, I went to West Point pretty young. I was 17 when, I got there. My birthday's in July. And I would probably say, hey, your instincts are pretty good, and don't listen to those, and be a little bit more confident, particularly when you're in your younger days. That would be one thing. The other thing I would say is that friends are very important, and that was one thing my mom and dad instilled in us. You always have your family, but you need good friends too. And West Point was really a pivotal in that. My parents would always say, they passed away recently in their 90s, they have great full lives, but they would be like, Pat, you can go anywhere in the country and you know somebody that, from your Army connections, and they're all great people for the most part. And, that's really a blessing, so I think that would be something too that I would tell anybody to cultivate and, try to have good friends. And
Wise
it was
words.
easy
It's
to
great
do
to
that.
get back in touch with you again, my friend.
Yeah,
We've got many more years together, all of us, and now we're all reconnecting. And this is kind of the payoff for all the work we've done.
yeah. And so I applaud what you're doing here and hearing all these stories of the past. And it's been wonderful. It was nice to see you at Dan's event and all the other classmates that were there.
Pat Antonietti, thanks so much for being here. It was really a great conversation.
Thanks, Paul. Good to see you. And we'll be in touch.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Courage Never Quits podcast, where any member of the class of 1986 who is willing to tell their story will be a guest. To get the word out and stay up to date on the latest episodes, hit the like and subscribe button. With over 900 living graduates, we have a lot of stories to tell, and you don't want to miss any of them. We'll see you in the next episode.